So this discourse XV, that's 15, right? The dynamics of spiritual advancement. Spiritual advancement begins when there is a radical change in the outlook. The worldly man lives mostly for the body, and even in those pursuits which do not seem to have reference to the body, the ultimate motive is in the desires connected with the body. When a man discovers a value in which the soul is predominant, the maintenance of the body becomes instrumental for the realization of a higher purpose. His, his or her body, hitherto a hindrance to spiritual life, becomes instrumental to the release of higher life. A man or woman then attends to his or her bodily needs without feelings of self-identification. Subtitle, Quest for the Goal. The beginning of spiritual advancement is conditioned by the quest for that goal for which man lives, the goal for which he loves and hates, and which he goes through joys and sorrows, and for which he goes through joys and sorrows. But though he or she may be moved by this incomprehensible divine destiny, it may take a long time before they arrive at the mountaintop of true realization. And the path is beset by pitfalls and precipices. Those who attempt to reach this mountaintop have to climb. And even one who has succeeded in scaling great heights may, by a slight mistake, fall from them. Therefore, the aspirant is never safe unless he or she have the help and guidance of a master who knows the path, who safeguards them from a possible fall and leads them to the goal. The aspirant carries with her the sanskaras which she has accumulated in the past. And in the intensity of her spiritual longing, they remain ineffective for the time being. But when there is a slackening of spiritual effort, the sanskaras gather fresh strength and arraying themselves in a new formation constitute formidable obstacles to spiritual advancement. The help of the master is most effective when the aspirant surrenders her ego life in favor of the unlimited life which the master represents. Complete self-surrender is difficult, but the essential condition of spiritual advancement is the lowering of egoism to its minimum. The objective of spiritual advancement is not so much quote unquote works as quality of life free from ego consciousness. If the aspirant has great things to her credit, which she has claimed as hers, her ego fastens itself upon these achievements and constitutes a formidable hindrance to life unlimited. Hence the futility of the observance of rituals and ceremonies, and of acts of charity and good works, external renunciation and penances, when rooted in ego consciousness. Subtitle, the Dilemma. It is therefore most necessary for the aspirant to keep free from the idea, quote, I do this and I do that, unquote. This does not mean to keep clear of all activity through fear of developing this form of the ego. She may have to take to the life of action to wear out the ego that she has developed. So she is caught up in the dilemma that if she keeps inactive, she does nothing towards breaking through the prison of her ego life. And if she takes to a life of action, she is faced with the possibility of her ego being transferred to these new acts. For spiritual advancement, the aspirant has to avoid these extremes and carry on a life of creative action. Treading the spiritual path is not like riding a saddled horse. It requires the utmost attention, since the path affords no halting places or room for expansion of the ego life. He who enters the path can neither remain where he is nor afford to lose his balance, but is like one who attempts to walk on the edge of the sword. To avoid both inaction and the pride of action, it is necessary for the aspirant to construct in the following manner a provisional and working ego devoted to the master. Before beginning anything, the aspirant thinks it is not he who is doing it, but the master who is getting it done through him. And after doing it, he does not claim the results of action or enjoy them, but offers them to the master. By so training his mind, he creates a new ego, which, though provisional, is able to become a source of confidence, enthusiasm, and energy. This new ego is spiritually harmless, since it derives its life from the master, and since when the time comes, it can be thrown away. There are thus two types of ego. One belongs to the limitations of the soul, the other helps towards emancipation. The passage through the limiting ego to the egolessness of infinite life lies through the construction of the provisional ego, generated through allegiance to the master. Marvin, if you're not busy, could you unmute and read?
A sudden transition, impossible. The aspirant has been accustomed to derive zest in life from his limited ego, and an immediate transition from the life of egoistic action to that of egoless action is impossible. If the aspirant were to be immediately required to avoid all forms of ego consciousness, he would be likely to revert to a state of negative passivity without any joy of expression, or seek expression through activity of a merely automatic kind. so that he could scroll, so that he could derive no sense of fulfillment. The real problem is that the aspirant has to abandon his life of the limited ego and enter into the ego-less life without lapsing into a state of the ebbing of life. Ebbing life may give apparent relief from the limitation of the ego life, but does not initiate the aspirant into ego-less activity. This is why spiritual advancement has usually to be very gradually and may take several lives. Where a person seems to have taken long strides in his spiritual advancement, it means either that he has recapitulated the advance already secured in previous lives, or that there has been special intervention by the master. Normally, advancement is gradual. The distance between the limited life of the ego and the limitlessness of the ego life has to be covered by gradual stages of ego transformation, so that egoism is replaced by humility, desires are replaced by contentment, and selfishness by selfless love. The ego that is entirely subservient to the master is not only indispensable and spiritually harmless, but directly contributory to the spiritual advancement of the aspirant, because it brings him closer to the master. The constant inner contact with the master makes available the special help that the master can give. The aspirant who renounces the life of the separate ego in favor of a life of self-surrender to the master is through this new ego living as an instrument in the hands of the master. It is the master who is working through him. Not I, but thou. Just as an instrument has a tendency to go wrong while being put to use, so the aspirant may get out of order during his working in the world, so that from time to time, the instrument has to be cleansed, overhauled, repaired, and set right. The aspirant who during his work may have developed new entanglements and shelters for the personal ego has to be renewed, regenerated, and purified so that he can go ahead. The need for recurring contact with the master. The aspirant who enlists in the service of the master may be compared to a broom by means of which the master cleanses the world of impurities. The broom is bound to accumulate the dirt of the world, and unless cleansed and given new strength, is bound to become less efficient in the course of time. Each time the aspirant goes to the master, it is with fresh spiritual problems. He might have got caught in new entanglements connected with honor, riches, or other worldly gains. He may get them, but be far from the goal of experiencing God on whom he had set his heart. It is only through the active intervention of the master that such spiritual disorders can be cured. The master helps the aspirant in his own inner ways, which have no parallel in the ways of the world. To be the recipient of this help, one must make a real effort to surrender to the divine will of the master. The personal ego renounced in the first surrender may reappear in a new aspect, even within the artificial ego meant to be completely devoted to the master, and may create disorder in its working. So this resurrection of the limited personal ego of the aspirant requires to be transformed through a renewed act of surrender to the master. Progress from one surrender to another is progress from a minor conquest to a major one, and the more complete forms of surrender represent the higher states of consciousness, since they secure greater harmony between the aspirant and the master, so that the infinite life of the master can flow through the aspirant. Spiritual advancement is a succession of one surrender after another until the goal of the final surrender of the separate ego life is achieved. The last surrender is the complete surrender, equivalent to the attainment of the truth, which is the ultimate goal of spiritual advancement. (16) Good and evil. The human mind not only passes through experiences, but is constantly evaluating them. These experiences are the opposites created by imagination when meeting life with a particular point of view. An individual's conception of what is acceptable and what is not changes according to the nature of the desires that happen to be dominant at any particular moment. But so long as there is desire, he is impelled to appraise his experiences in relation to it. He divides experience into two parts. One that contributes toward the fulfillment of the desire, the other that prevents its fulfillment. Instead of meeting life without expectation, entanglement, or shirking, the mind is divided into opposites. Of these opposites, the division between good and bad is spiritually most significant. It is based upon desire to be free from the limitation of all desires. Those experiences and actions that increase the fetters of desire are bad. Those that tend to emancipate the mind from limiting desires are good. But since good experiences and actions exist in relation to any desire, they bind equally with bad experiences and actions. All binding disappears only when desires disappear, and freedom comes when good and bad are reconciled and leave no room for choice. Animal sanskaras. When consciousness is fully developed, there is still a preponderance of bad elements, since at the subhuman level stages of evolution of consciousness, since the subhuman stages of evolution, consciousness has been chiefly operating under the limitations of lust, greed, and anger. The experiences and actions created and sustained by such ego-centered tendencies have left their imprint on the developing mind, which has stored them in a somewhat similar manner to that in which the cinematic film records movement. If all the accumulated animal sanskaras had been bad and none good, the appearance of good tendencies in human consciousness would have been impossible. But animals do sometimes develop the qualities of self-sacrifice, love, and patience. Though some animal sanskaras are good, most are bad, and consciousness finds itself subject to a propelling force, which is mostly bad. From the start of human evolution, the problem of emancipation has consisted in cultivating and developing good sanskaras so that they may overlap and annul the accumulated bad sanskaras. Cultivation of good sanskaras is achieved by fostering experiences and actions that are the opposite to those that predominate in animal life. The opposite of lust is love. The opposite of greed is generosity. And the opposite of anger is tolerance or patience. By trying to dwell in love, generosity, and tolerance, a man erases the tendencies of lust, greed, and anger.
Thanks a lot, Marvin. Meher Daruvala. Are you ready to read, Meher?
I'm ready.
Awesome.
Yeah. The general process of freeing oneself from the limitation of sanskaras has therefore to be accompanied by the process of renouncing the bad for the good, whether a person happens to be good or bad at any given time is dependent upon the operation of his sanskaras. From this point of view, the sinner and the saint are what they are by necessity. They have the same beginning and the same end. The stigma, eternal degradation, does not belong to the sinner, and the saint need not have pride in his attainments. No one, howsoever saintly he may be, has attained moral virtues except after a life of moral failings. And no one is so bad as not to be able to improve. Everyone, however, he becomes a shining example. None is utterly lost, and none need despair.
Oh, could you read from everyone? You skipped a line, my love.
Oh, become better until becomes, no, sorry, everyone, however depraved he may be, can gradually become better until he becomes a shining example. None is utterly lost, and none need despair. The limited self can live in good sanskaras. The gradual unfoldment of the good brings love, generosity, and peace, and the good sanskaras deposit by the manifestations of these qualities overlap and balance the opposite bad sanskaras of lust, greed, and anger. When there is an exact balancing and overlapping, there is reconciliation and termination of both types of sanskaras, and consciousness changes from bondage to freedom. Credit and debit must be exactly equal. If the account is to be closed, but mostly either the debit or the credit side is greater and the account is kept running, it is important to note that the account remains open, not only by the excess of debits, but also by the excess of credits. It can be closed only when the two balance, but in field of sanskaras, such as balancing is rare at any particular time. Either the bad or good are predominant, and just as an account can be kept running either by excess of debits or of credits, the life of limited self is prolonged and sustained either through the excess of bad or good sanskaras. The limited self can persist through good sanskaras in the same way as it can maintain itself through bad sanskaras. Balancing of good and bad sanskaras. This problem of balancing sanskaras is not a mathematical problem of matching equal amounts, where it's simply a question of equal quantities. The problem could be solved only through persistent accumulation of the good sanskaras. If there is a reduction of the accumulation of bad sanskaras, and side by side an accumulation of good sanskaras at a greater rate, sooner or later the good would be equal to the bad, and the necessary balancing would be affected. But for bad point, the problem before each center of consciousness is a specific problem.
Sorry, Meher, go from here, okay?
From
But
where? Okay, but for the imposition of consciousness, the good and the bad sanskaras have not only to balance, but there has to be a point to point overlapping of the one opposite the other. So the problem before each center of consciousness is a specific problem according to the qualitative variety of the nature of accumulated sanskaras. If the accumulation of good sanskaras proceed irrespective of the existing sanskaras, there is a possibility of accumulating the excess of good sanskaras side by side with the existence of bad ones of a different kind. For example, through self-mortification and asceticism, some forms of attachment may be annulled, but other forms may remain. Then the aspirant may not only ignore the forms of attachment that have remained untouched, he may even carry on further the practice of self-mortification and asceticism by the force of the sanskaras created by those very practices. When that happens, an excess of good sanskaras is created without involving the termination of the limited ego. And even if the other forms of attachment which had remained untouched are subsequently undone, the ego gets transferred to those new sanskaras and continues to live a limited existence through them. Can somebody take it from there, please?
Marian, could you unmute and continue, please?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Emancipation is not a matter of accumulation of virtue. It requires intelligent adjustment of sanskaras. Each center of consciousness is unconsciously gravitating towards the final emancipation of truth realization. And there is a tendency in the mind to invite those opposites that meet the spiritual requirements of the situation. But it is not a mechanical and automatic process, independent of intelligent effort on the part of the aspirant. More often than not, the aspirant finds it impossible to arrive at what is necessary unless he has the help of a master who has insight into what is necessary. The prison of the good. It has been said that the good sanskaras can be a medium for maintaining the limited self. When a person looks upon himself as good, he is experiencing self-affirmation through identification with an opposite. It is a continuation of separative existence in a new form. This new house, which the ego constructs for itself, is difficult to dismantle because self-identification with the good is often more complete than self-identification with the bad. Identification with the bad is easier to deal with because as soon as the bad is recognized, its grip on consciousness is lessened. But to lose the grip of the good presents a more difficult problem, since the good carries a semblance of self-justification. The ego changes identification with the evil for identification with the good, because the latter gives a greater sense of expansion. But sooner or later, the aspirant perceives the good to be no less a limitation. The difficulty concerning evil is not so much in perceiving what it is as in dissociation. The difficulty concerning good is in perceiving that it is a limitation. This difference arises because animal sanskaras are firmly rooted owing to ancient origin and long accumulation. But it is important to note that the good binds as much as the evil. Beyond good and bad. The ego lives through either the bad sanskaras or the good, or through a mixture of good and bad. When there is balancing of the good and bad, so that they both disappear, what remains is a clean state of mind which reflects the truth. Nothing is written on the self. The sanskaras are deposited on the mind. The self remains untarnished, but only when the mind is clean can it reflect the truth. When the mind sees the self, there is illumination. The mind seeing the self, however, is not the same as the self knowing itself, for the self is not the mind, but God beyond the mind. Therefore, even after the mind has seen the self, it has to be merged in the self if the self is to know itself in truth. This is realization. In this state, the mind with its good and bad sanskaras has disappeared. It is a state beyond the mind and beyond good and evil. There is one existence characterized by infinite love, peace, bliss, and knowledge. The strife between good and evil has disappeared because there is neither good nor evil, only the one undivided life of God. The place of occultism in spiritual life. 1. The value of occult experiences. Spiritual emancipation brings an unfoldment of many psychic capacities latent in the human soul, which increases the scope and range of human consciousness. The new elements often play an important part in helping or hindering the emancipation of consciousness. And the aspirant has to understand the value that belongs to occult experiences, such as unusual and significant dreams, visions, glimpses of the subtle world, and astral journeys, and to learn to distinguish realities from hallucinations and delusions. Though it is easy to exaggerate the importance of occult experiences, it is not unusual to doubt their validity and to treat them with the contempt accorded to characteristic forms of mental aberrations and abnormalities. The attitude of unqualified contempt for occult experience is, of course, most pronounced in those who are not even abecedarians in the direct knowledge of occult experiences. It hurts the ego to admit that there might be unexplored fields of the universe accessible to a limited number of persons from the circle of which it happens to be excluded. And the contempt to which occultism is at times exposed is almost always the outcome of ignorance about what it really means. This attitude is, of course, different from that of the cautious and critical mind. Those who have that attitude are endowed with humility and openness of mind and are ready to admit the existence of occult realities when they come within their reach. Dreams. The master usually helps the aspirant through ordinary means. But when there is a special indication, he may use an occult medium to help him. Dreams are among the common media for touching the deeper life of the aspirant. Masters have not infrequently first contacted aspirants by appearing in their dreams. Such dreams, however, have to be distinguished from ordinary dreams. In ordinary dreams, the subtle body is active in exercising its function of seeing, testing, I think it might mean tasting, smelling, touching, and hearing. But the soul is not then consciously using the subtle body. As these experiences are received subconsciously, they are subjective, relating to physical activities and concern physical life and the creations of the nascent sanskaras stored in the mind. Sometimes, however, a dream that is indistinguishable from an ordinary dream may be the reflection in the subconscious of some objective experience of the subtle body, not merely a product of fancy.
Thanks, Marianne. Ernie, could you unmute, please?
Most dreams are the subjective and subconscious experiences of the subtle body and have no special spiritual significance, except that they can be the occasion for the forging of new sanskaras or the spending of old ones, and that occasionally they shed light upon the complexes and unfaced problems of personality. But such dreams can never include that which is not in some way a part of past experience, and they allow scope for novelty only in respect of new combinations of events that have appeared in past experience. The rare types of dreams are those relating to persons and things known not in this life, but in some past life. And still more rare are the dreams of what has not appeared in this life, but is to appear in future. Ordinary dreams are thus different from dreams possessing occult significance. The beginning of occult experiences. Very often, when the aspirant is experiencing psychic unfoldment, he has experience of the subtle world in the form of visions, lights, colors, sounds, smells, or contacts. These experiences are fitful, and the aspirant is likely to treat them as hallucinations. Even so, he finds it impossible to resist their directive influence because of their intrinsic potency. The spiritual journey, however, becomes smoother if the aspirant learns to cultivate the right attitude to these phenomena, which consists in taking them for what they are worth. But this balanced attitude, the aspirant in the initial stages finds difficult. It is possible either to exaggerate the importance of glimpses into inner worlds and to develop a craving for the repetition of these experiences, or to treat them as abnormal phenomena and underrate their significance. Of these alternatives, the attitude of exaggerating the importance of occult experiences is the most common, because novelty charges them with importance. Craving for occult experiences. In fact, the ego of the aspirant tends to be attracted to this new field and has a sense of being a rare person admitted to an exclusive privilege. The more such experiences are received, the more they are desired, and there may develop the habit of depending upon occult guidance for each step in the path, in rather the same way as those who take drugs get addicted and require the stimulation even when they could formerly do without it. To avoid this pitfall, the master takes care not to encourage the craving for occultism. Occult experiences are vouchsafed to the aspirant when they are necessary for spiritual purposes, not when he asks for them. If the aspirant is found to attach undue importance to occult experiences or to develop a craving for them, the master may weaken and annul them. This is similar to giving relief to a patient by a surgical operation and serves the purpose of protecting the aspirant from forging fresh chains for self-limitation. The aspirant must under no circumstances be allowed to get caught up in false values, which lead only to unnecessary delay in reaching the goal. The introduction of the aspirant to occult realities is necessarily a very gradual and prolonged process, and the master is never anxious to expedite it, as few persons are really qualified for the expansion of their experience in this dimension. validity of occult experiences. As in the initial stages, the appearance of occult realities is fitful. The aspirant sometimes doubts their validity and treats them with caution, so as to reduce the possibility of being deluded. But occult experiences often bear unmistakable credentials of their validity. And even when such credentials are not obvious, they compel attention because of the unusual significance, bliss, peace, and directive value with which they are surcharged. It is mainly because of these characteristics that the aspirant can discriminate between occult experiences and delusions. Hallucinations are erroneous perceptions of things which do not really exist and remain objects of doubt, though they may have a likeness to normal perceptions. Delusions contain a greater element of falsity because they consist not only in seeing that which does not exist, but in believing it to have real existence with a certainty which leaves no room for doubt. Neither hallucinations nor delusions bring bliss nor peace to the person who experiences them. The bliss and peace that are attendant upon genuine occult experiences are a reliable criterion of their genuineness. Even when occult experience is such that it can be clearly distinguished from illusion, it may become the object of doubt. This happens when the person who has had the experience discusses the matter with others, who, because of their incapacity to understand such things, shake him in his conviction. It is for this reason that in ancient times, the masters usually required the disciple to maintain strict secrecy about occult experiences. Even a deep experience is likely to become weak through contradiction and skepticism. Unless the aspirant has learnt to rely upon his own inner experience, irrespective of what others may say. If the aspirant is to make progress and profit through occult help, he must develop confidence in himself and the master. He must not look to others for guidance, because those who will understand his problems or his experiences are few. The aspirant must indeed be prepared to face the possibility of his being misunderstood. If an occult experience at the time of its occurrence has served the purpose of giving a new momentum to spiritual endeavor, it often does not matter if in retrospect the aspirant considers it a form of delusion. However, there are some occult experiences that are vouchsafed to the aspirant as a guidance, and with regard to them, it becomes necessary that the aspirant should cease to doubt their validity. But to seek corroboration of occult experience is definitely unhealthy, and the master gives corroborative confirmation only when he considers it necessary. Further, he takes the initiative himself. Whatever he does arises out of his own discretion and is in no way dependent upon expectations that the aspirant may have developed. But when spiritually necessary, the master does increase the efficacy of occult experience by confirming its validity and authority through corroboration from the normal range of the aspirant's experience.
Thanks, Aaron. Mahu.
Okay. Astral journeys. I'll wake you all up. In the advanced stages of the path, the aspirant becomes spiritually prepared for the free use of the forces of the subtle world. He may then get used to undertaking astral journeys in his subtle body after leaving the physical body in sleep or wakefulness. Those astral journeys that are undertaken unconsciously are much less important than those undertaken with full consciousness as a result of deliberate volition. This implies conscious use of the subtle body. The conscious separation of the subtle body from the outer vehicle of the physical body has value in making the soul realize its distinction from the physical body and in achieving its control. I read this again. The conscious separation of the subtle body from the outer vehicle of the physical body has value in making the soul realize its distinction from the physical body and in achieving its control. He can at will put on and off the external physical body as if it were a cloak and use the subtle body for experiencing the subtle world and making journeys through it when necessary. Next topic, an aid to intuition. The sights, smells, tastes, contacts, and sounds that are experienced through the conscious use of the subtle body are as definite as the experiences gained through the conscious use of the physical body. They are not vague or subjective as in ordinary dreams, but are as subjective as any experiences of wakeful consciousness. The power to undertake astral journeys, therefore, involves considerable expansion of the scope of experience and brings its own opportunities, not only for promoting one's spiritual advancement, but also for helping others who have not yet entered the path. The development of occult forces is not to be regarded as a substitute for the inner effort that the aspirant must make. Occult experiences are gifts from the masters, and in spiritually advanced souls, they serve the purpose of unveiling much obscured intuition, removing some of the difficulties on the path, and filling the aspirant with the confidence and enthusiasm necessary to cope with requirements of the path. But the aspirant makes real progress by putting into practice the best intuitions of his heart, not by the passive acceptance of occult experiences. Next topic is the occult basis of a spiritual life. Those who have even preliminary acquaintance with the structure and laws of the inner spheres of existence know that the isolation of human beings is a fiction. Whether they desire it or not, all persons constantly act and interact upon each other by their very existence, even when they have not established contact on the physical plane. There are no limits to the influence of man. The magnetic influence of the subtle spheres knows no barriers of frontiers or distance or any other conventional limitation. Good thoughts as well as evil, cheerful moods as well as gloomy, noble and expansive feelings as well as petty and narrow ones, unselfish aspiration as well as selfish ambition, all influence others, even when not expressed in words or deeds. Thus, the world of mental life is as much a unified system as the world of matter. The physical world as a vehicle of a spiritual life has its own importance, but the connections existing between different persons is by no means fully realized by considering only the contacts of the physical world. Darshana or presence. The physical presence of masters does not yield its significance except in the context of the inner planes. The ancient rishis attached great importance to having the darshana of saints and masters, the source of the flow of love and light, which makes an irresistible appeal to the inner being of the aspirant, even when he receives no verbal instruction. The effect of darshana is dependent upon the receptivity of the aspirant, whose reaction is determined by his own sanskaras and past connections. Often the aspirant is satisfied with the darshana of the master and has no desire for anything else from him. To derive bliss from the mere darshana of the master is a great thing because it indicates that the aspirant has desirelessness and love, the two essentials of a spiritual life. Having had the darshana of the beloved, the aspirant naturally desires nothing except to have more and more darshana. And he is thus impelled to have as much darshana or company of the master as possible, which results in drawing the aspirant closer to the master on the inner plane of life.
Thanks, Mahu. Vijay Balakar.
Jai Baba, the feet of the master. Like darshana, falling at the feet of the master also has a value of its own. The feet, which are physically the lowest part of the body, are from the spiritual point of view the highest. Physically, the feet go through everything, good and bad, beautiful and ugly, clean and dirty, yet remain above everything. So spiritually, the feet of the master are above everything in the universe, which is dust to them. When people come to a master and touch his feet with their hands, they lay the burden of their sanskaras on him. He collects the sanskaras from the universe as an ordinary person collects dust on his feet. There is a custom that after the aspirant has the darshan of the master and falls at his feet, he washes his feet with milk and honey and places coconut near him as his offering. Honey represents the red sanskaras, the milk represents the white sanskaras, and the coconut represents the mind. Thus, the convention, which in some parts has become established in connection with the greeting of the master, really symbolizes the throwing of the burden of sanskaras on him and surrendering him the mind to him. The adoption of this inner attitude constitutes the most where is it's gone? Constitutes the most critical and important step which the aspirant takes for initiation into the path. Mental contact. Once the aspirant has the bliss of darshana of a master, even when he is unable to establish frequent personal contact with him, his mind turns to the master. This process of establishing mental contact is essentially different from the imaginative revival of past incidents. In the activities of the imagination, the recall of past incident is not necessarily animated by a definite purpose, whereas in establishing mental contact, there is a definite purpose. Owing to the directive power of purpose, imagination, ceasing to be a mere revolution of ideas, reaches the master through the inner planes and establishes contact with him. Such mental contact, which the master is as fruitful and effective as his physical darshan, the inward repetition of such mental contacts is to construct a channel of communication between the master and the aspirant, so that the aspirant becomes the recipient of the grace, love, and light flowing from the master, in spite of the apparent distance between them. Thus, the help of the master goes out not only to those who happens to be in his physical presence, but to those who establishes mental contact with him. Special precautions. The master devotes attention to the individual need of the disciple. And the first thing he does is to provide the disciple from such influences as will divert his attention from the path or interfere with his progress. Often the master requires the disciple to accept some kind of temporary isolation so that his mind is guarded against impacts that might impede his spiritual progress. The ancient yogis, under instruction from the masters, prepared their own food and did not allow anyone to remain present at the time of eating it. They wanted to avoid also likely to catch the impressions of another's desire and be affected by them. In the early stage, they wanted to avoid the impressions of the sight of that person. A disciple is also likely to catch the impressions of another's desires and be affected by them. In the earlier stages, the aspirant must guard against complications that might arise through association with others who are not on the path. But the master gives instructions for the severance or avoidance of certain connections and contacts only when they are specially indicated. Usually, however, all that is necessary is secured by the constant company of the master, and need does not arise to submit the disciple to isolation. But although the disciple may be outwardly in touch with the world, he is mentally detached through inward connection with the master. Helpful contacts. Just as the master may isolate a close disciple from undesirable contacts and connections, he may encourage and bring about new and fresh contacts when he sees them to be in the spiritual interest of the disciple. He has understanding of the sanskaras and the karmic ties and their complications, and can consciously help people to enter into such associations as will allow and call forth responses and activities to help progress along the line of least resistance or by the shortest possible route. He uses his knowledge of the past lives of people, so their sanskaras and connections, to help them to economize spiritual energy and to employ it with best results. Wonderful. The master utilizes spiritual forces. The unity of inner plane makes it possible for the master to use his disciple as a medium for his work. Even when the disciple is unconscious of serving the purpose of the master, this is possible because the disciple, through his love and understanding of the master and his obedience and surrender, establishes a rapport between himself and the master. Those who come into direct contact with the master receive his direct help, and those who are closely connected with his disciple receive his indirect help. Sharing of spiritual work is by no means one-sided, for even the disciples who merely think of the master or meditate upon him share the spiritual work in which the master may be engaged. As one who is one with eternity, the master is beyond time. But as one who is interested in the spiritual upliftment of humanity, he assumes many of the limitations of time and is capable of being helped in his work by the voluntary cooperation of his disciples. The master feeds upon the love of his disciples and utilizes the spiritual forces released by them for his universal work. To love the master is to love all, not merely symbolically, but actually, for the word the master receives on the subtle plane. He spiritualizes and distributes. Thus, he not only strengthens the personal links which the disciple may have with him, but gives them the privilege of sharing his divine work.
Thank you, Vijay. Elizabeth.
Welcome.
Do you want me to read?
Yes, please, if you'd like to.
Sure. The internal eye. By infinite ways, the master draws the aspirant into his own being so that he may get disentangled from the mazes of the universe and come to desire God. This longing for God is present in the aspirant from the beginning, but the master makes this longing more intense and articulate by opening the internal eye of the aspirant. When the internal eye is opened, God, who is the object of search and longing, is sighted. As the gaze is turned inward and fixed upon the supreme reality, the desire for union becomes more ardent than when groping for God through speculation or imagination. When the time is right, the master opens this internal eye. The aspirant has to realize that God is the only reality and that he is really one with God. This implies that he should not be overpowered by the spectacle of the universe. The universe in the self springs into existence from the tiny point in the self, which is referred to as Om. But the self has become habituated to experience through various media and experiences the universe as a rival to, or even an enemy of, the self. Those who have realized God constantly see the universe as springing from this Om point, which is in everyone. The process of perception of reality runs parallel with the process of creation. And the reversing of the process of perception without obliterating consciousness amounts to realizing the nothingness of the universe. The self sees first through the mind, then through the subtle eye, and lastly, through the physical eye. And the self appears to be vaster than all it perceives. All the self perceives is finite, but the self is infinite. When the self retains full consciousness and yet sees nothing, it has crossed the universe of its own creation and has taken the first step to know itself as all. Occult powers as obstacles. The process of withdrawing consciousness from the universe and becoming conscious of the self is accompanied by an increasing control of the vehicles of consciousness. Such control is made possible by the vivification and activization of unused centers of control. And the functioning of these new centers brings a number of occult powers. These new powers are dangerous because they too often come before the aspirant has become spiritually perfect. In fact, egoism can flourish through the acquisition of such occult powers. And the aspirant may not only take delight in possessing them, but may use them for earthly purposes, from which he may not have freed himself. They are therefore rightly regarded as obstacles to the attainment of realization. When God is realized, all occult powers dwindle in importance. They have their existence in the nothingness, which is the universe, and the one who realizes God is established in the supreme reality. But while the universe is zero to the God realized, he may voluntarily assume responsibility towards those souls who are enmeshed in the tangles of the universe. He can then freely make use of occult powers for the spiritual good of others. furtherance of the divine plan. There is nothing that does not admit of direct or indirect control by the masters of wisdom. Large social phenomena such as wars, revolutions, and epidemics, as well as physical phenomena such as earthquakes, floods, and other changes, are amenable to their control and direction through the release of the great forces of the exalted planes on which the masters are. They can also use occult forces for securing cooperative and coordinated spiritual work, and they frequently hold meetings on the higher advancement of humanity. The eternal being is all. The eternal being in all is one and functions as a unity. Those who have become conscious of this unity become fit for unlimited responsibilities because they have shed the limitations of the human mind and have become impersonal and universal in their interests, so that they are effective vehicles for the execution of the divine plan on earth. 3, occultism and spirituality. Occultism is a branch of knowledge concerned with the study of the universe and human personality. And in this respect, there is no difference in principle between occultism and other sciences also concerned with the study of these subjects. The difference arises because other sciences are concerned with such aspects as are directly or indirectly accessible to ordinary observation. The development of occult knowledge is conditioned by the unfoldment of the latent and hidden powers of the human spirit. A psychical research society approaches occult knowledge in the same attitude as that in which other forms of knowledge are approached, because, in principle, there is no reason why such knowledge should be looked upon as either less or more valuable than other forms of scientific knowledge. Such societies pursue the study of occult knowledge in an organized and cooperative form. The masters also have at times deemed it desirable to reveal to mankind theoretical knowledge about certain important features of the occult world, such as the facts of immortality and reincarnation, the existence of different bodies and planes, and the laws concerning evolution and the operation of karma, because it gives the right background for spiritual aspiration and effort and brings the perspective of man as near to truth as possible. But the masters have consistently preferred to attach minimum importance to detailed knowledge about occult realities and have withheld information upon them.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Rolf, are you able to read? Rolf's at the doctor's, I think. So we'll stop here. Page 165 in Occultism.
How much more is there to this particular discourse? Is it long?